Okay, what am I going to title this video to get past the censors? We are going to talk about the modern history of Europe for a few minutes, in abstract. The history of Europe in the 1700s was kings and queens everywhere. Monarchies of this kind or that kind. The history of Europe in the 1800s was still kings and queens and monarchies and just old-fashioned dictatorships of one kind or another. And right up until the 1900s, when they started transferring over into dictatorships of one kind or another. And all that came crashing down a bit in 1945. And after that, Western Europe lived under the aegis of the United States to protect them from communism. And Eastern Europe, being under the boot of communism, was vivid enough that everybody in Western Europe knew that this was fairly important to stay out from under the Soviets. So we had things like border security. And you couldn't just cross their borders willy-nilly, because who knew who was coming in for what and to do what, and things were kept track of. Now that stopped being enforced slightly after the Berlin Wall fell. It became a bit of a fetish, didn't it? To not have borders, to be borderless, to allow border crossings. And Europe became very borderless, didn't it? After the Berlin Wall fell, they moved towards this. It was a fetish. And it's not that all of the problems started then. I know of immigrants from Denmark who moved to Utah and started farming in Utah in the early 1980s. And so that is 35 years ago. 40 years ago, if you please, from when they started their plan to move. That's how long Denmark has had a bad enough Muslim problem. But the rest of Europe is not immune also. Germany has been bringing Turks in since the 50s and the 60s. In the 1970s, that was starting to get out of control in Turkey. And so that's been 40 years that was getting out of control and there were problems. So Europe has been importing Muslims, and that accelerated drastically after the fall of the Berlin Wall for two reasons. One, the fetish of taking down borders, and two, the United States sort of going hands off and saying, all right, you know, we don't need to be involved in the day-to-day worries of what goes on in Europe anymore. So we stepped back. And so, here's my point. All that time up to 1945, Europe was a frickin' mess. Just an unholy mess. From 1945 up until 1990, half of Europe was an unholy, totalitarian mess. A frickin' mess. From 1990 onwards, when America wasn't there taking care of things and seeing to it that the Soviets were not advancing, from 1990 onwards, Europe has again become a complete and utter mess. So, my point overall is, don't expect Europe to stay peaceful. Don't be surprised if Europe doesn't stay peaceful. And it's just, it's going to happen again. This thing never again, it's going to happen again. It's here, it's happening. What do you call tens of thousands of rapes and stabbings? What do you call hundreds of church burnings? What do you call the police being complicit with invading gangs? What is that? Is that not a civil war? What is that? I'll tell you what that is. That is standard operating procedure for Europe. Standard operating procedure.